Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel, and my guest today is Delphi Ellis. Hello, Delphi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your book, obviously, I had to have you on. It's called Answers in the Dark, and it's all about sleep and dreams. Now, it's one of the things that you talk about in your book is that, nobody ever asks, how did you sleep? But you do. So do I. It's one of the things that concerns me when somebody comes to work with me. As a therapist, I'm always very keen to know how they're sleeping.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's such an important question to ask, I think. And especially in a world that's so busy at the moment, I think we tend to prioritize so many things. We're often worrying about how other people are and where people, how people are finding life and things like that. And yet the sleep is probably the one thing that we should be prioritizing every day. And so when we ask people how they are, I think knowing how they're sleeping is one area in particular that kind of gets missed in that discussion.
Yeah, and it's a really big issue because sleep deprivation has serious impact on not just mental health, but on physical health as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm sort of careful to talk about in Answers in the Dark is that I think most of us know that. I think most of us know the impact of sleep deprivation because we've been there, we've experienced it, whether it's due to a short period of poor sleep, if there's a new baby in the house, or you're going through a difficult time following a bereavement, for example, or a relationship breakdown, then I think, most of us can align with that to the extent where you'll know if you've had a rotten night's sleep that your mood is affected the next day, you can't concentrate so much, you're perhaps forgetful, but also maybe a bit irritable and edgy. Whereas if you've had a wonderful night's sleep, it's almost as if you've been gifted something overnight and the day just seems to feel more manageable. So I think most of us can connect with that experience of poor sleep. And ironically, it's worrying about not getting a good night's sleep that can cause us to get a poor night's sleep. And that's one of the things I talk about in Answers in the Dark, and how we've kind of we've fallen into this trap of worrying about sleep to the extent that it's stopping us sleeping.
I'm sure anyone who suffered from insomnia for a long period of time recognizes that dread of going to bed. It's that simple. Or if you're going through a spate of having nightmares every night, you wake up as a relief. Waking up is a relief in the mornings. So it's we all have this experience. I also really like the way that you mentioned sleep hygiene. It's so true that sleep hygiene is important because it's about signaling to the body that we are unwinding. But it's like a little drop in the ocean of reasons of why we don't sleep. So it's important, but it's not the solution.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And you're so right. One of the things I talk about in Answers in the Dark is we've kind of, if you go on the internet, if a person is struggling to sleep and they go on the internet and look at, reasons why they might not be able to sleep or how to improve their sleep, or they pick up a magazine that's got a special feature on sleep, 9 times out of 10, that web page or that article will feature a discussion about sleep hygiene, which is essentially the habits we have during the day which can help or hinder our sleep at night. So when we're talking about good sleep hygiene, we're talking about things like reducing caffeine, making sure we're not exercising too late into the evening, making sure we're not eating too late. And again, all those things, people kind of know that. People kind of know that those things don't necessarily help. And most people I speak with, they're doing all of that. They're doing all the right things. and they still can't sleep. And so this is one of the reasons why you're absolutely right. And I talk about this in Answers in the Dark. Sleep hygiene definitely has its place. It's definitely important for us to think about what might we be doing that's not helping? What might we be doing during the day that's actually contributing towards poor sleep? Things like caffeine, as an example. But for the rest of us, I think there is space to talk about what I referred to in the book as situational insomnia, which is for people who are doing all the right things. They're having a nice warm bath before bedtime, they're doing some meditation, they're maybe listening to some calming music, they're doing all the right things, and they still can't sleep. And so this is where situational insomnia shows up as a person's experiences, their circumstances are what's preventing them from getting a good night's sleep. And so this is one of the reasons why I lead into the book in talking about grief, because one thing I mention in the book is, if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that grief doesn't just belong to death. It belongs to anything that mattered to us that's no longer there. And so if a person is, and I defined earlier, I said, for example, when a person's going through a bereavement or a relationship breakdown, to me, these are all losses. So a relationship breakdown, divorce, redundancy, even a child leaving home to go to university is a loss. And if we aren't given permission to talk about that during the day, it's going to show up at night, whether that's in the form of poor sleep or whether that's in the quality of dreams that we're having. So yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned it, because for me, sleep hygiene is just this, it's almost like this panacea. We've kind of created this idea that if we just cut down coffee, maybe go to listen to some calming music and those kinds of things, then we'll manage to get a good night's sleep. And it's just not that simple. People have to look at what's happening in the context of their lives.
If only. So the way I see it is very simple. We can't sleep because our body is tense. It's in a state of tension, anxiety, depression, stress, whatever you want to call it. We have the sympathetic system is just going mad.
Yeah.
And the body's got itself stuck in a state where it's on red alert and it's not resting. That's why we can't sleep. And the question then is, how do we get from there to a balanced state where the parasympathetic nervous system is getting a look in?
Yes.
That's when we're going to get sleep. So yes, sleep hygiene matters. And I'll tell you where it matters. It matters for people whose attitude is, I have to be on the go 24 hours a day. It really matters if you are in that trap where you're anxious about getting everything done and being perfect, and you don't have a bedtime routine. There is nothing to signal to your body to actually sleep, because you're not a machine that can be switched off. You need unwinding time. You need time to let yourself just process the day and so on, because otherwise you're not going to go to sleep. But beyond that, can you go to sleep? And how stuck are you in this mode of anxiety, panic, depression? How stuck are you there? And then that's where the real work begins.
You're so right. And it's very much that green zone, red zone stuff that researchers like Rick Hansen and others talk about in their work, where we're effectively, what we're aiming for when we're going to bed at night is green zone. So we want to make sure we're in that relaxed, that parasympathetic response, that that the ideal conditions, if you like, for us to be setting ourselves up for a good night's sleep. But ironically, what tends to happen, like I mentioned earlier, is we find ourselves in the red zone, even through something as simple as, why can't I sleep? So even something, just a thought like, why can't I sleep, is enough to move us into that red zone, that sympathetic nervous response, where we effectively could end up in fight or flight. And there is no way, when we go into fight or flight, our body's automatic response system to a perceived danger or threat, there is no way that our brain is going to authorize sleep if we're in red zone. There's just no way, because as far as our brain is concerned, there's a problem here. And it's not just a problem, it's danger. And so when our brain is in that kind of red zone place, we need to find ways. I refer to it in the book. I have this chapter called Going Down the Plug Hole, because for many people, what tends to happen is just that thought of, why can't I get to sleep, is enough to start this spiraling, which takes us, as I call it, down the plug hole, because it's dark down there. And sometimes it's very difficult for us to move back into the green zone when we're in that intense, noisy place in our minds that's saying, what's wrong with me? Why can't I sleep? I'm going to feel awful in the morning. I've got a presentation tomorrow. I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to get everything wrong. Or remembering an argument that you had 20 years ago and the things that you wish you had or hadn't said. You know, it can be anything. And this is what tends to happen in the middle of the night when we find ourselves, especially as you say, if we keep ourselves busy. And this is another thing that I sometimes talk about with my students and with people I work with, is that we have moved now into this mindset that busyness is aligned with importance. So the busier I am, the more important I must be. And so this is why for so many people now, when we ask the question, how are you? The go-to response these days is, I'm just so busy, as if that is somehow aligned with, you know, look how important I am. And I don't mean that necessarily in an egoic way. It's because we genuinely are busy. We've genuinely got so much to do. And so we're going at 100 miles an hour all day. And then we stop with what I call the roadrunner effect. You know, we just suddenly stop at 100 miles an hour. Our head hits the pillow, and then we are just, our bed becomes this magical place that reminds us of all the things we didn't do today, of all the things we have to do tomorrow, of the argument we had 20 years ago. And it is just because we are just so busy and we're on the go all day, every day. And so, yeah, I absolutely believe that we need to be finding ways to manage the mind helpfully when we find ourselves in that stuckness, you know, that you were describing, that stuckness of, you know, what's wrong with me? You know, why can't I sleep? Why can't I get this right? And I think, you know, we were touching on there as well around perfectionism. And I think this, again, you know, I talk about it in the book, is we don't like failing at anything as humans. We don't like failing at anything. So even not getting a good night's sleep, you know, some people might see that as a failure, you know, and anything we see as a failure, we're less likely to talk about. And so inevitably, so much of what we're going through goes underground because we're not talking about it, we're not dealing with it, we're not perhaps even given permission to talk about it. And so inevitably this goes underground. And then, of course, what happens then is if you do manage to get to sleep, it's going to show up in your dreams. And so when a person is going through a difficult time, I mean, ironically, depending on some research or, you know, some things I've read, even sleep deprivation can lead to nightmares. So ironically, even if you do manage to get to sleep, you might then have a nightmare which wakes you up. And so you end up in this vicious cycle of, as you said, not wanting to go to sleep, managing to get to sleep, and then having a nightmare. And so it just becomes this never ending, you know, this awfulness. And that for me is why, you know, managing the mind at night, as I talk about in Answers in the Dark, managing the mind at night is so important, because otherwise we're just going to find ourselves in this endless loop of what's wrong with me.
Well, I guess the answer is, it's not that there's something wrong with you, but there's something wrong in the way that you are allowing life to pressure you to the point where you feel like you have to justify your existence by being on the go all the time, if that's what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And yes, you know, if you are busy, very often we get busy to distract ourselves from pain. Mm-hmm. And so we're distracting ourselves from pain, and then when we stop, when we're going to bed and we stop, the distraction is gone. And hey, guess what? It's me, myself, and I. Um, let's have a conversation, and then we're up all night talking. So it's a very difficult thing, and I think for a lot of people, the worst type of insomnia is the one where you have no problem going to sleep, but you can't stay asleep. That's where it gets really difficult, is where you wake up, at the classic 2, 3 in the morning, depending on when you've gone to bed, and boom, you are awake and you are up and you have not had enough sleep. So this is a real problem. And as I'm sure anyone watching is coming to realize, what you and I are saying is this goes deep. It goes into what's really going on at an emotional level. So one of the things in your book is you talk about dreams, and I really like the fact that you talk about it not being, a dream dictionary, because however useful they might be, I'm with you, dreams are highly individual. And so I want to hear that dream being described in as much detail as can be remembered. And it's from there, when, looking at what is the feeling behind this dream, what's the energy behind it, that's what we, and also listening to people and having heard their various dilemmas, very often I can see exactly what the dream is mirroring, but they're not making the link. So tell us about your experience working with dreams and how that's helpful to people.
Yeah, so I started exploring dreams from a very young age. I grew up in an environment where we would talk about dreams around the breakfast table. So it happened very naturally for me when I started training as a qualified counsellor. It just happened organically that I would talk to people about their dreams. And over the last 20 years, I've worked with people going through some of the most difficult times in their lives. My background's in bereavement, so I've worked with people predominantly bereaved by murder and suicide. And through that process of helping people, as I call it, get their sparkle back when they're ready, we would often have these really deep and meaningful conversations about the dreams that they'd had, because again, as well as asking about their sleep, they would often volunteer information about the types of dreams that they were having. But I always saw it as an exploration. I never saw it as me saying, this is what your dream means. Because for me, dreams are a gift that only the dreamer can unwrap. Yes, they can come to us and say, I've had this dream, can you give me some insight on it based on your experience and those kinds of things. But ultimately, that dream is encrypted so that only the dreamer ultimately not only can interpret it, but actually then has the agency to do something with it. Because once they understand what the dream is about and where it's coming from and the wisdom that's kind of within it, they then have an opportunity to decide whether they're going to do something with that dream or not. And this is why I also describe in the book that dreams are like a friend, and we've all got friends that they can see what we can't. So we've got friends who, like it's when you split up with a boyfriend and they'll say, oh, I never liked him anyway. It's that kind of thing where people just kind of instinctively, impart their wisdom. But because often we're in the thick of it, we can't see it. And so our friends often can. They can observe on the outside looking in, and they may give us advice or wisdom based on what they can see and their perception of what's happening. But I'm sure we've also got friends who we tend to take what they say with a pinch of salt. We might not necessarily be invested as much in their friendship. And so when they offer us wisdom, especially unsolicited advice, I hasten to add, if they offer us wisdom that we didn't ask for, then, we may take what they say less seriously. And I think this is one of the reasons, and I talk about this in Answers in the Dark, is I think this is one of the reasons why people don't always remember their dreams either. Sometimes people will say, oh, I never remember my dreams. But of course, we know that we all dream every night. You know, the science backs that up now. We all dream every single night. It's whether or not we remember them. And don't get me wrong, I remember reading a funny piece of research once that said if we remembered every dream we'd ever had, our heads would be so big we'd have to carry them around in a wheelbarrow. So we're not meant to remember every single dream we've had, but if we don't place an importance on them, if you've grown up in an environment where people said dreams don't mean anything, just forget them, or you've decided that you don't want to explore their content or their meaning, those friends will leave you alone. You know, if you ignore your friends for long enough, they will leave you alone. And so your dreams are very much like that. And this is one of the reasons why in the book I emphasize that if you want to start that journey of discovery, then it starts with learning how to remember them and record them helpfully. And I provide tips and guidance on that. But remembering that ultimately, as the dreamer, they are the best person to decide what that means. You know, they might, even if they decide not to do anything with it, you know, even if they unpack it and they think, okay, yeah, I know what that's about, they might then decide, I'm still not going to do anything about it. And that's fine. You know, that's all it is. But ultimately, they are the best person to decide what it means.
Absolutely. And your job and my job is to help them to come to that understanding as well. So there are times when we can wake up exhausted from the emotional ringer that our dreams have been. What do you suggest when that's happening?
So I think there's different reasons for that. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the hangover effect. And this is when, for example, we are setting our alarm for right in the middle of deep sleep. So we're waking up in the morning, you know, we've set our alarm, say, for 6 o'clock. We might have actually been wide awake at 5 o'clock, but thought to ourselves, oh, I've got an hour before I have to get up. I'm going to go back to sleep, not realizing that going back to sleep, we're pushing ourselves back into deep sleep. And so we set our alarm for right slap bang in the middle of deep sleep. So I genuinely think that one of the reasons why as a population, and by the way, this isn't just in the UK, this is, you know, internationally, worldwide. I think the World Health Organization's last research said that something like 20% of the global population now suffers with insomnia. So 1 in 5 of us globally. So I think one of the reasons for that is because we're waking up in the middle of deep sleep. We've set our alarm for this time. And so we experience, as I say, what we call the hangover effect. But I also think that sometimes, because our dreams are like nighttime therapy, we, even if we don't remember them in the morning, we may have worked through something during the night. And so it makes sense that you're exhausted when you wake up. You know, if you've ever had personal counselling, you'll know that just after an hour of personal therapy, we can often feel drained, you know, especially if it's been intense in terms of personal disclosures and things. So if you imagine during the night, you can be dreaming up to 3-4 times a night, depending on your length of sleep and your sleep cycles. It makes perfect sense that some people wake up in the morning feeling like a dishcloth that's been wrung out because they've got, you know, they've been working through some really intense stuff during the night. So it is a form of nighttime therapy. And I refer to that in the book. I make that distinction that sometimes dreams are a form of nighttime therapy. And I think that's one of the reasons we can wake up, feel shattered. I mean, the good news is it won't last forever because, you know, once you've worked through it, you've worked through it. But for some people, that combination plus setting their alarm for slap bang in the middle of deep sleep, they're going to wake up feeling exhausted.
That's absolutely true. It hopefully it's a short-lived spurt, perhaps, of a few nights where you're dreaming, and you're dreaming intensely, and you wake up exhausted. And sometimes, you know, as you say, we don't even remember those particular dreams. We just have the exhaustion, or we wake up feeling really depressed, or we wake up feeling really anxious. And essentially, it's because we've been reliving whatever it is that's really upsetting through our dreams, in the same way that if we are talking about something that's very distressing with a friend, we're reliving it, and it can leave us feeling a bit down, to say the least. So there is that. But the other thing that you mentioned is that hangover effect
Mm-hmm.
from waking up in the middle of the sleep cycle. That's such an issue. And, you know, one of the things that personally I've discovered, that because winters were awful for me in that respect, but getting those light alarm clocks that gradually wake me up naturally has put an end to that. But what it did was it showed me, because I already knew this, but doing something about it showed me how important it is to gauge when the best time is for us to wake up naturally, rather than because it's convenient, because that's when we have to get up. So what do you recommend?
So this is one of the reasons I talk about in Answers in the Dark. I talk about the big myths of sleep. And one of the big myths of sleep is that we all need 8 hours sleep. It's a big myth. And the reason I say it's a myth is because everybody is different. So some people need 6 hours sleep, some people need 10 hours sleep. Teenagers definitely need more sleep. They're not being lazy, you know, they definitely need more sleep than older people. When you're poorly, you need more sleep. If you've had COVID, you'll know that your body just wants to sleep when you've got COVID. It's a natural response to an illness in the body. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that because we've got so caught up in this idea that we need 8 hours sleep, we tend to then set our diary, our calendar, and our alarm clock around this notion that we need 8 hours sleep. So say, for example, you've got to be up at 6 o'clock in the morning because you've got to catch a train at, you know, 7:30 or 8 o'clock, whatever. So you set your alarm for 6 in the morning. You might then think, right, okay, but I've got to get 8 hours sleep. So I'm going to work back 8 hours. That means I've got to be in bed by 10, right? So you're already setting your sleep time and your wake time by a notion that you need these 8 hours, but you might not be sleepy at 10 o'clock at night. That might not be your natural bedtime. Your natural bedtime might have been at 9 o'clock when you felt naturally sleepy, but you pushed through because there was something on the telly or you've got jobs to do or what have you. So you push through, you missed the window of opportunity to go to sleep. And so you go to bed at 10 o'clock thinking, right, I've got to be up at 6, here's my 8 hours. But you're not sleepy at 10 o'clock because you've pushed through it. The sleep pressure has reduced. So you're not feeling as sleepy as you did at 9. And so now you're laying in bed at 10 o'clock, staring at the sleeping, thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I sleep? I've got to be up at 6 in the morning. And so again, then that comes back to what you were saying about the red zone stuff, you know, about the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight kicks in. This is going to be bad for me if I don't get to sleep right now. And your brain doesn't authorize sleep. And so you then find yourself trapped in this cycle of thinking about how bad this is going to be. Combine that then with the fact that you've then set your alarm clock in the slap bang in the middle of possibly your deep sleep cycle. And so you're going to wake up feeling exhausted as well, if you manage to get any sleep at all, because you were so worried about getting up at 6 in the morning. So I think one of the things that I encourage people to do is ditch the myth. You know, first of all, ditch the myth that you need 8 hours sleep. Find out what your natural rhythms are. So if you feel naturally sleepy at 9 o'clock at night, go to bed when you're sleepy. And I have this so many times that when I've done workshops and talks around the country, I've asked people that question, when do you go to bed? And so many people give me a time. They say 10 o'clock, 10:30, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock. They rarely, if ever, say when I'm sleepy. And yet that is the most optimum time for you to go to sleep, is when you're sleepy. And in the same way, setting that alarm clock in the morning for when you feel naturally wakeful. So if you're naturally waking up at 5:30, if you're using one of those lights you mentioned that helps manage that process of, you know, telling your brain that it's time to wake up and everything, because it's suppressing the melatonin and everything else that's going on in your body at the time that kind of contributes towards sleep and sleep pressure, then you find out when you're naturally wakeful. So you'll find that your rhythms naturally settle down if you start to go to bed when you're naturally sleepy and you wake up when you're naturally wakeful, rather than almost trying to lurch yourself out of sleep because your alarm has gone off, if that makes sense. And I think that's a trap we've fallen into.
And it's that that thing about, you know, if you have a nap, to limit the amount of time that you're having this nap, precisely because you don't want to go into deep sleep. Because if you go into deep sleep, that's it. You know, you're going to really find it hard to get out of it, and it can spoil, you know, your plans for the afternoon or whatever. So it's really what we're talking about is getting better at listening to our bodies.
Definitely.
I know that beyond a certain point in the day, there's no point in me even trying to work. It's just ridiculous. And I also know that, generally speaking, between 9:30 and 10, I am seriously ready to start getting ready for bed.
Mhm.
Um, so it's listening to that body rather than thinking, oh, I don't have to be up early.
Mm.
That's the one. I don't have to be up early so I can stay up,
Mhm.
despite the fact that my body is crying out for sleep.
Exactly that, and it's a trap we fall into at the weekends as well. You know, we think, oh, it's the weekend, you know, I can have a lay in on a Saturday morning. And yet ironically, and I talk about this in the book, in Answers in the Dark, I talk about social jet lag. So social jet lag is what happens on a Monday morning when you've had two lay-ins on a Saturday and a Sunday. You've effectively reset your body clock. So your body now thinks that your natural, or the time that you're going to get up in the morning is 10 in the morning, as an example, you know, or 9 o'clock, whatever, because you've had a lay in on a Saturday and a Sunday morning. So come Monday morning, when you're wrenching your body out of bed at 6 o'clock, because that's when you've set your alarm, you suffer with this social jet lag, and it's without having even traveled abroad. You know, you're suffering with a form of jet lag because your body is saying, what are you doing? You know, we were getting up at 10 o'clock yesterday and the day before. Why are you making me get up at 6 on a Monday morning? And I loved what you were saying about power naps as well. I talk about power naps in the book. One thing I would say with power naps, you're absolutely right around the 20 to 30 minute sort of optimum. Power nap can be just enough to give us a sort of an energy boost and things like that. And this is one of the things that I recommend to people that work shifts, because I speak with paramedics and police officers, and one of them was telling me very recently that their organization has actually now extended what would be their lunch break, but it's in the middle of the night because they're working a night shift, and has actually extended their lunch break now, so that as well as, you know, having something to eat if they need to, they can also have a 20 to 30 minute power nap. And for me, that's the kind of progressive thing we need to see companies doing. We need to see companies starting to recognize that people that are working shifts during the night may well need that sort of 20 to 30 minute buzz that they get from a power nap, because it will give them the opportunity to refresh and recharge, rather than them using energy drinks, for example, to get them through a night shift. And then, of course, you know, in the morning when they try to go to sleep, they're so pumped with caffeine, they then can't get to sleep. So I think power naps definitely have their place. And you're right, you know, if we kind of get into the habit of having a power nap in the afternoon, that can definitely impact our sleep at night if it's something we're kind of doing. But for people that work shifts, I mean, they can be an absolute blessing. So yeah, I think they have their place. We just have to get it right.
You only need to be commuting and coming home around 5, 6 o'clock on the train, and you see those lucky enough to have a seat. How many of those people are naturally having power naps?
Yeah.
And they seem to wake up just when they need to. And
Incredible.
so many of us have done this. Why? Because we've started our day at 6 in the morning, and it's now 11, 12 hours later, and it's been a busy full day.
Mm-hmm.
And just that little nap
Mm-hmm.
on the tube, on the train, is enough to help us get through the next part of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, what we're illustrating through power naps, our conversation about power naps, is the extent to which sleep is important,
Mm.
and how we need to not neglect it, either through believing that we must stay up beyond the time when we're tired because there's so much to do, or set the alarm unnaturally early for our bodies because we've gone to bed too late, or we're setting the alarm for when we're in the middle of a deep sleep. It's a really important thing to address. I have a little question for you, which I think it would be quite useful to address, which is this. When we're in that, when we discover that waking at 6 a.m. is waking us from deep sleep, is there a way that we can calculate a better time to go to sleep so that we're waking perhaps before 6 a.m, but when we've naturally begun to come to, if you like?
Yeah, I think this for me is where this knowing your sleepiness and working out your cycles. So one of the things that I offer in Answers in the Dark is like a sleep diary, so people can start to recognize. And I mean, you could try this, say, when you go on holiday for a week, assuming you're not going abroad, because again, body clock and other things might interfere with that. But let's say you're having a week at home, but you've decided to have a week's holiday. You might decide that you use that as an opportunity, those 5 or 7 days, to start to notice when you feel naturally sleepy and going to bed. So actually trying it, you feel naturally sleepy at whatever time that is, between, you know, whether it's between 9 and 11, whatever, and trying to go to sleep naturally, and then noticing when you feel naturally wakeful in the morning. And again, that might be anywhere between sort of 5 and 7 in the morning. But the other thing to think about as well is how you're managing those moments of wakefulness during the night as well. So you mentioned earlier that, you know, it's not just the trouble falling asleep, it's the trouble staying asleep. And so for some people, they may well wake up at 4 a.m. I've got a whole chapter in the book called The 4 a.m. Mystery. And it is that big question about why is it? Because 4 a.m. is too early to be getting up and starting our day, unless we have to for work. But 4 a.m. is too early to be getting up and starting our day. But again, for some people, they might think, well, I've got to be up in an hour. What's the point of me going back to sleep? Or they may well be so stressed that they've woken up at 4 a.m. that they then can't get back to sleep. And so it is, again, it's about managing those periods of wakefulness as well, which will, again, align with, like we were talking about, managing the mind when you wake up in the middle of the night. If we can move back into that green zone of thinking, okay, this is normal for me to be awake at night. My body is going to do that periodically because it likes to just check I'm okay. It's a natural bodyguard reflex that we have. I refer to it in the book as the sentinel reflex. So we have this natural instinct to wake up at times during the night. I'm not talking about every 20 minutes, every hour. I'm talking about maybe once during the night, periodically, we wake up, and it's just our brain's way of saying, yep, is everything okay? But then being able to say that's normal and going back to sleep. And so then you might find that if you can get back to sleep, you'll find that you naturally wake up again, like I say, between 5 or 7 in the morning. And so I do think it is about, as you were saying, getting to know your body, getting to know how your body works, listening to your body when it's tired, listening. And when I say tired as well, it's a really interesting point I talk about in the book as well, is that you can be absolutely dog tired, but you can't sleep. And because tiredness and sleepiness are not the same. And so we need to be registering not just that tiredness where you could go to sleep, you know, you could go to bed because you're so tired, but registering that sleepiness as well. So actually being able to recognize when your eyes start drooping, especially if you're in front of the telly and you start to notice your head nodding and things like that. Those are very subtle cues that your body is giving you. It's time to go to bed. So if you can register those things and then combine that with finding that natural wake time for you, so that you're not relying on the alarm so much, you might find that your rhythms start to settle down and your quality of sleep improves significantly.
You know, I went through a period of terrible insomnia due to lots of stress. And I, counter to the sleep hygiene advice, I put a TV in the bedroom.
Mm.
And that was so that I could actually capture that moment when I could go to sleep. So that I'd be watching and I would deliberately choose something that I enjoyed, but which was not too stimulating, and allowed myself to get into that sleepy state. And then I think my partner would at that point just switch off the TV and switch off the light and leave me to go to sleep. Because at that point, things were so stressful that recognizing that moment and getting up and getting ready for bed would have done it all over. I'd have been awake all over again. So it was getting myself to bed, and then I couldn't read because I didn't have the concentration to read. So this was a way to do it, something that I enjoyed, but which was not overly stimulating. Perhaps I'd seen it lots of times, before. And then it would just get me into that sleepy state and off I'd go. And this is the thing, we have to experiment and see what
Absolutely
does it, because I have no trouble falling asleep if I'm sitting on the sofa watching TV. But then I'd get up, go to bed, and in that process, I'd be awake again. So we did a different approach. And I think that's what I would encourage people to do, is experiment, see what works for you.
Definitely.
And the middle of the night one is the hardest one, I find, to crack.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. And I think this is one of the reasons why in Answers in the Dark, I talk about this concept of sleep hygiene. The concept of it is helpful and healthy, getting us to think about what might I be doing during the day. And I remember on one of my workshops, there was a guy there and he turned around to me and he said, I do all the wrong things. He said, I smoke before I go to bed. I watch television, I do this. And I said to him, how do you sleep? He said, great. He said, I have a great night's sleep every night. And I said, seriously? I said, don't worry. If you find, I said, if when you wake up in the morning, you feel refreshed, because that's the other thing. Some people will say, I have a great night's sleep. I slept 8 hours, but they don't wake up feeling refreshed. And that was the other question I asked him. I said, do you wake up feeling refreshed? And he went, and I said, that's the thing, so it's not even so much that, as soon as your head hits the pillow, lights out, that's you for 8 hours. It's the quality of the sleep that you get and how refreshed you feel when you wake up in the morning. So you're right, there are things that we can do, but because of this concept of sleep hygiene that says, oh, you mustn't, watch the TV and you mustn't do this and you mustn't do that, I think it's got us trapped into a corner of thinking these are our only options now. The only options we have before we go to bed is that we must switch the TV off an hour before bedtime. We must avoid caffeine after 12 o'clock in the day. We must listen to calming music, as if those are our only options. And I can say, in all the years I've been doing this, when I've asked people, what have you tried to get to sleep? And I'm talking about people who have insomnia, trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. And the answer is always everything. They have tried absolutely everything, from eye masks to pillow sprays to warm baths, you name it, lavender, whatever, if that works for you and you're not allergic to it. And this is where I say to people, this is when we have to come back to that idea about what works for you. What do you find helpful? And I think it's more complicated because, of course, in the middle of the night, especially if you have a bed partner, what you can't do at 4 a.m. is switch the TV on, or you can't flick the light on and read a book. And I think for some people, and this is one of the reasons why the activities I focus on in the book include things like mindfulness. So when you can't switch the TV on or go and do other things or, what have you, you can do a breathing activity that might work for you, or you can repeat a mantra in your mind, or you can take yourself off on what I call a virtual holiday in your imagination. Those are things that you can do that might be helpful at 4 a.m. when you can't switch the TV back on, or those other things that might disturb other people in the house. So you're right, I think it is very much a personal kind of plan of well-being. You know, it's very much, and so much of it is rooted in that embodiment awareness, being aware of how our body is speaking to us, what it's saying, and how we can take our cues from that.
Well, you know, as with everything in life, we would love for there to be a quick fix solution. But this is not a quick fix solution. It is something that we need to work at. And it's not a word I want to use in relation to sleep, but what it means is that it's a process that we have to engage with to understand the emotions which are keeping us stuck in that sympathetic mode of go, 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 and alert, 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 alert. And then find ways of dealing with those emotions. Heaven is the idea of a wonderful night's sleep, you know, for many of us, and waking up refreshed and energized in the morning. For many people, that's hard to achieve, and we need to really work through those emotional issues, which is, of course, what you and I are here to do, is to help with that. So a good place to start actually is with your great book, Answers in the Dark. So I will be putting a link to that on the description box. And if people want to learn more about what you do and find you, how do they do that?
So I have a website, which is delphiellis.com, and the book has its own website as well, which is answersinthedark.com. So if people want to go straight to that, they can, or they can find out more about me at delphiellis.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Delphi, for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting.
And thank you all for watching. Goodbye.